And Jeff, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you very much, everyone. My name is Jeff Woolsey. I'm a Principal Program Manager here at Microsoft in the Azure Edge and Platform team. And I'm really excited about our session today. What's new in Windows Server 2022? Again, got a lot of content, so I'm going to get right into it. And let's start with kind of what drove us into in terms of requirements and what we were building in Windows Server 2022 is really what customers are telling us, what you were telling us. So let me give you an example of a few of the things you guys have been telling us. Number one, hybrid cloud is our strategy across the board, just period. Everybody's telling us the same thing. And, you know, it's been interesting. I've been tracking this very closely. You know, 5-6 years ago, if you'd asked, there was about 10 to 15% of people said, no, I'm going to do private cloud only. I'm not going to do anything in the cloud. And then I had about 10-15% say I'm going to do everything in the public cloud, and everybody else is in the middle hybrid. Well, what's interesting is since that 5 years, the private cloud only people, that is gone. I don't even run into those people at all anymore. Everybody tells us, nope, we're hybrid cloud. And then I see, again, 10-15% people say, no, we're going to do everything in the public cloud. And those folks are generally startups. They start in the cloud. They do. You know, they're relatively new. They don't have a legacy. They don't have a history. So for them, starting in the cloud makes sense. But for most everyone else, if you have a history, if you've been around for 10, 15, 20 years, you've got a lot of infrastructure, you've got a lot of apps, you've got a lot of customer relationships. A lot of people are figuring out, no, I want the best of both. I want a hybrid strategy. Next, ransomware. Ransomware is definitely top of mind. We're deeply concerned about ransomware. One of our industry colleagues was hit. We don't want to be next. Heard this multiple times. This is a relatively constant refrain, and unfortunately, it's only getting worse. We want to modernize our apps. We need to run cloud apps on premises. Running Kubernetes on premises is challenging. Yes, I've spoken to many people who have gone down this path. They say, you know what, I'm going to start building new cloud apps. The developers start building them in the Azure Kubernetes Services, AKS. It's actually the fastest growing and fastest adopted Azure service in Microsoft history, and people are deploying AKS for all of their cloud apps. At some point, someone realizes, wait a minute, this is awesome, but I actually still need some of this on premises. It's manufacturing, it's retail, it's data sovereignty, it's privacy, it's HIPAA. Insert your reason here, but someone says, hey, that cloud app I still need on premises. And they go, okay, well, we'll just download Kubernetes because it's open source and we'll start installing it. And then they realize, wait a minute, this thing is really challenging. This is really difficult. I have to patch it. I have to manage it. I have to deal with the ongoing life cycle of this. And on top of this, by the way, is this thing secured by default? Spoiler alert, it's not. By default, Kubernetes is open with wide everything open out of the box, so everything will run, but it's not secure. So how do you do that? Again, Kubernetes on premises is very challenging. And then finally, customers keep telling us, look, we have distributed apps and infrastructure, and with hybrid cloud, we're getting even more of that. We need a way to manage and secure it all. We've got stuff running in the cloud, we've got stuff running on premises, we've got stuff running in branch offices, we've got stuff running in our own data centers. How can we see it? How can we secure it? How can we manage it? How can we do this consistently? Can we provide the same policy and governance to all of our resources everywhere? So with Windows Server 2022, this was driven by your requirements. With advanced multi-layer security, we're going to elevate the security posture of environments starting with the OS. With hybrid capabilities, we're going to extend the data center to Azure for greater IT efficiency. For the application platform, we're empowering developers and IT pros to deploy modern apps and modernize existing apps faster than ever. And then finally, we're going to help evolve organizations with new apps and data center modernization options on Azure. So let's go ahead and get started with multi-layer security. A recent IDC survey finds that more than 1/3 of organizations worldwide have experienced a ransomware attack or breach. You've been telling us ransomware keeps us up nights. We don't want to be next. We understand that concern. Here's another one. Another recent article where dozens of hospitals and clinics are canceling surgeries and diverting ambulances because a ransomware attack knocked out access to virtually all their operations. And this isn't just recent, this has been going on for some time. Here's a few examples from 2020. In February, over 142 million personal records from former guests at a resort hotel were found on the dark web. In July 2020, over 450,000 residents of Polk County, Florida, had their driver's licenses and social security numbers exposed in an attack. To put this in perspective, the average cost of a data breach is $3.62 million, and this is just scratching the surface. The number keeps going up and up. At Microsoft, we have a strategy to protect, defend, and prevent. Protect with a hardware root of trust, defend against firmware level attack, and prevent access to unverified code. And that starts with firmware protection. 83% of all businesses have experienced a firmware attack in the past 2 years. The goal of firmware attacks is simple. Attack the system before the OS is started and implant malware. Let me actually give you an example of what one of these attacks looks like in detail. So here's an anatomy of the Robinhood ransomware. Robinhood ransomware is distributed as a packaged executable that contains multiple binaries. One of these files is a gigabyte driver, gdrv.sys. This driver has a vulnerability that can allow elevation of privilege, enabling an adversary to gain kernel privileges and then disable kernel mode signing to facilitate the loading of an unsigned driver. The unsigned malicious driver is then used to disable security products from the kernel. The Robinhood ransomware then goes on to encrypt files and demand ransom from the victims. Now, Robinhood is not an isolated threat, leveraging a vulnerable driver. In the last 2 years, the Defender ATP research team has seen a rise in the use of vulnerable drivers by adversaries, ranging from commodity malware to nation-state level attacks. Now, this may sound grim, but there is good news here. And the good news is we have a solution. In fact, we actually have proof of its effectiveness already with Secured Core PC. Secured Core PCs provide more than twice the protection against infection. That's why we're introducing Secured Core Server with Windows Server 2022. A Secured Core Server is a modern device that comes with the highest level of hardware, software, and identity protection ready right out of the box. A Secured Core Server, it protects boot up with hardware root of trust. Secured Core Servers use industry standard hardware root of trust coupled with security capabilities built in today's modern CPUs. With Secured Core Server, it defends against firmware level attack. Secured Core Servers use hardware-rooted security in the modern CPU to launch the system into a trusted state, preventing advanced malware from tampering with the system and attacking at the firmware level. With Secured Core Server, it prevents access to unverified code. Once the CPU is brought up safely, the OS takes control, and hypervisor-enforced code integrity ensures that all code in the OS kernel is trustworthy. To help raise awareness, we're making Secured Core security obvious and visible with Windows Admin Center. We're going to highlight security features and work together with you to make these Secured Core safeguards the new normal for servers. So firmware, compute, memory, these are a few aspects of security. Now let's switch gears and discuss network protection, starting with Transport Layer Security, or TLS. TLS is a widely adopted security protocol designed to enable privacy and data security for communications all over the internet. To be super clear, this is a fundamental building block of network security. You are using this right now every single day, whether you know it or not. TLS is used to encrypt communication between web apps and servers, like browsers loading a website. And it's also used to encrypt things like email, messaging, voice over IP, all of that stuff. It is literally ingrained in the fabric of the internet. Windows Server 2022 uses the latest version, TLS 1.3. Now, TLS 1.3 has two really huge benefits. First, security. Many of the major vulnerabilities in TLS 1.2 and previous had to do with older cryptographic algorithms that were still supported. TLS 1.3 drops support for these well-known and very vulnerable algorithms, such as RSA key transport, which doesn't provide forward secrecy, the CVC mode ciphers, which are vulnerable to Beast and Lucky 13 attacks, the RC4 stream cipher, which is not secure for use in HTTPS, The arbitrary Diffie-Hellman groups, there's a CVE for that. And export cybers, which are vulnerable to freak and logjam attacks. So right off the bat, it says, nope, we're dropping all of this insecure and vulnerable cryptographic algorithms. So that's benefit number one. Benefit number two is TLS 1.3 is faster. The number of handshakes has been cut in half, and in cases where the client has connected to a website before, the handshake has 0 round trips. This makes HTTPS faster and improves the overall user experience. And while we're covering network security, let's also cover another important aspect of network security, SMB encryption for your file shares. Now, as I'm sure most everyone here knows, SMB or Server Message Block Protocol is a network file sharing protocol that allows applications to read and write to files and to request services from server programs in the network. SMB encryption protects against man-in-the-middle attacks. With Windows Server 2022, we've made SMB encryption more secure and faster. Server 2022 introduces new AES 256 cryptographic suites and will automatically negotiate the most advanced cipher method possible. With Server 2022, we've made SMB encryption flexible and easy to use. You can configure it per single share or for the entire file server. And SMB encryption can be enabled via group policy, via PowerShell, or with one checkbox in Windows Admin Center. And in fact, here you can see, this is the settings for the file share at the server level. This is server-wide SMB encryption. In addition, SMB encryption now supports SMB Direct. Previously, enabling encryption disabled direct data placement. This had a huge performance impact. Well, now the data is encrypted before placement, resulting in security and a massive performance boost. So in addition to that performance boost, we've added AES 128 and AES 256 to raise the security bar as well. Pretty awesome. Now, while we're talking about SMB, we got to get to a sweet new SMB feature, and that's called SMB Compression. And just want to give a huge shout out to my friends over in the file server team. This thing is ridiculously cool. So SMB compression allows an administrator, user, or application to request compression of files as they transfer over the network. Compressed files have huge benefits. Number one, they will consume less network bandwidth and take less time to transfer. And there's a slight cost of increased CPU usage during transfers, which most likely you'll never even notice. A common scenario we're trying to tackle here is copying virtual machines. These files are usually very large and compressible. Let me show you a test that we ran. So in this test, we copied a 20 gigabyte virtual hard disk from a Windows 11 client to a Windows Server 2022 file server. Without SMB compression, this took 2 minutes and 43 seconds, or 163 seconds. With SMB compression, it took 28 seconds. So we're almost 6 times faster. And again, keep in mind that for that time that it was done, it wasn't consuming any network bandwidth. So it consumed significantly less network bandwidth. And of course, if you want to enable SMB compression, you can use group policy, you can use PowerShell, or you can enable it with one checkbox in Windows Admin Center. SMB compression requires Windows 11 clients and Windows Server 2022 file servers. So you may be thinking, hey, this is great. I've got a whole bunch of old file servers running, heaven forbid, 2003 or 2008, probably 2012, 2012 R2, 2016. How can we migrate to 2022? Well, guess what? We have an easy tool already built into Windows Server called the Storage Migration Service. The storage migration in Windows Server 2022 can help you modernize your file server to Windows Server 2022, or if you want, you could even migrate it to Azure. Both options are there. If you need to keep your file servers on premises, and quite honestly, a lot of folks do, you can use then Azure File Sync to centralize your organization's file shares in Azure Files while keeping the flexibility, performance, and compatibility of an on-premises file server. And essentially what happens is with your Windows file server and Azure File Sync, What it essentially does is it transforms your on-premises file server into a hot cache. So think about it. Let's assume for a moment you've got a 10 terabyte file server, okay? And guess what? It's running low on storage. Oh no, now I've got to go figure out how to add more storage to this, or I've got to copy stuff off to another location. You don't have to do any of that with Azure File Sync, because basically with Azure File Sync, you tell the file server, hey, this file share, always keep 20% of it free. And what it will do is it will automatically, transparently tier that up into the cloud. And so it still appears there on your file server. If you need it, you click on the file and it will copy it back down from Azure. But if you don't, it'll keep you copying, it'll transparently move the least used data up into the cloud. And in fact, I know of a customer right now that has a 10 terabyte file server that is effectively over 100 terabytes. And it used to be a huge pain point for them because they were constantly trying to offload data off their file server. And essentially, this is magically moving it up into the cloud form, up to the cloud. I heard someone just mention OneDrive for servers. Yeah, you can actually think of it very much as analogous to that. The OneDrive guys get kind of upset if I say that, but you know, the analogy holds true. It automatically does it for you. So with Windows Server 2022, the storage migration service also can do things now like migrate from NetApp FAS systems to Windows Server or Windows Server in the cloud or on premises as well. So a lot of really cool stuff here with the storage migration service, the Windows File Server with SMB, with Azure Files and bottomless storage, which kind of takes me to storage. And a lot of people have been using storage spaces direct. It's a very, very popular aspect of Windows Server. We've had, for over a decade now, and it delivers phenomenal performance using tiering and caching and flash, and it's just all automagic. And in fact, this is the feedback we've gotten from you. S2D rocks. The performance, caching, and tiering are awesome. It would be great if you could use this in a single node environment, not in a cluster, but on a single server for test dev. You got it. That's why we're introducing Windows Server 2022 single node caching and tiering. Brand new feature for the first time ever. And this is super awesome. So Windows Server 2022 takes many of the great benefits we've learned from storage spaces direct in a clustered environment and brings these to a single server. So this solution is great for random I/O workloads because it uses SSD for intelligent caching. It's great for SQL and container development, or even a file server if you're using Azure File Sync for backup and DR. It is very important to understand this is a single node. This is not a high availability solution. This is not HA. Let me repeat, this is a single node and not an HA solution. So, use a battery backup, use, a backup. If you need HA, then use storage spaces direct in a failover cluster and you get the full HA solution. That said, I know for dev, home labs, enthusiasts, folks that have proper backup and DR, this can be a phenomenal solution. Now, this requires Windows Server Standard or Datacenter 2022 and at least 2 drive types, an SSD and hard drive or an NVMe and hard drive. So let me kind of go a little bit deeper into this. So this solution is a mix of both tiering and caching. This combination improves random read performance as data is read from the parity tier and cached on the faster mirror tier. So we recommend using a portion of the SSD as a mirror tier in a mirror accelerated parity configuration. This is for fast writes to the SSD. The other portion of the SSD is used as a read cache using our storage bus layer technology that we've had in S2D for the last 10 years. And by default, 15% of the SSD is used for cache. This way, both read and writes are hitting the SSD, and you're getting phenomenal performance. So let's start with the writes. When a write operation occurs, it lands on the mirror tier. Once the mirror tier fills up to 80%, we start rotating down to parity. That's why there's a clock here, because we have to calculate the parity as we rotate and destage to the parity, the hard disk tier. There are 2 huge benefits here. First, the write occurs to SSD and thus is really fast. Second, when the data is destaged to the parity tier, it is done sequentially, which is optimal for hard drives. So there's a benefit at both areas. So next we have reads. With read operations, the read is cached from the parity tier. So while the first read comes from the hard disk, subsequent reads are cached from the mirror and thus are much faster. Now you may be wondering, hey, wait a minute, could I do this with 2019 or a previous version? No, you absolutely could not. This scenario does not work. There's a whole bunch of new logic that we had to put in here for the single node to make this work. And in fact, if you tried it, number one, it wouldn't work. And even if you tried to, the performance would not be great because we actually have to do some logic there with the SBL cache, the storage bus layer cache, to make all of this perform well. So finally, you may be wondering how many SSDs are required. In this scenario, you can see I've got 3 SSDs and I've got 6 hard drives. People always wonder, hey, can I go super cheap and do 1 SSD? You know, I really wouldn't recommend it. Technically, you can use actually just 1, but you don't get resiliency. So we recommend at least 2 SSDs at a minimum. So one last note about single node caching and tiering. Because ever since I've started talking about this and evangelizing this feature, a lot of people have been very excited and been trying it out and have looked at the documentation and have some questions. So first, the server must have the failover cluster feature installed. Now that may sound weird. That may sound odd because I said this is a single node and this is not a cluster, and that is correct. It's not a cluster, but you do have to have the failover cluster feature installed. And the server cannot be a member of a cluster. So that may sound like it's at odds with each other, but remember how I told you we've adapted parts of storage spaces direct for this scenario. Well, that is part of the failover cluster feature, which is why this must be enabled. So yes, you have to enable the failover cluster feature. However, the server cannot be a member of a failover cluster. And in fact, we have a full tutorial on this at docs.microsoft.com. All right, enough about storage. Let's talk about CPUs and scalability. So we've been talking about security. We've been talking about encryption. I want to point out that Windows Server 2022 takes full advantage of the latest CPU advancements. With Windows Server 2022, it takes advantage of the latest 3rd generation AMD EPYC processors and 3rd generation Intel Xeon Scalable processors. You get higher workload performance designed for flexibility at scale, new cryptographic acceleration, and advanced security features. In addition, I also know that there are many die-hard folks out there that are running SQL Server on bare metal, and they're always pushing the limits of compute and memory. And I definitely see this in higher ed where they are pushing the edges of and doing some interesting things in computer science. Well, folks, we've raised the bar again. As you can see, 2012 and 2012 R2, we supported up to 320 logical processors and 4 terabytes of RAM, which was pretty awesome. 2016, we raised it to 512 logical processors and up to 24 terabytes for a physical server. And I'll be honest with you, the number of people asking for those numbers to go even higher, I can count on one hand. But the big thing is Azure had to have this because Azure, we run the biggest servers that ship on the planet. And so when Azure said, folks, we need this number to go up, we said, how big would you like it? Guess what? You get it for free. That's right. Windows Server 2022 supports up to 48 terabytes of RAM per physical server. That is not a typo. 48 terabytes and support for up to 2048 logical processors. So, you know, we know this is critical. Like I said, SQL Server is a critical component for your big scale up mission critical workloads, and we've got you covered there. I also want to point out that we've added support for nested Hyper-V virtualization for AMD EPYC and Ryzen processors. So we've had this for Intel, but now we're introducing this for AMD EPYC and Ryzen. The host must be Windows Server 2022 or Windows 11, and the guest can be any supported guest. So it doesn't matter, all of the standard guests apply, but now you can do nested. And this is interesting because with nested Hyper-V, you can run Hyper-V in Hyper-V, which can be great for test dev and labs. And of course, nested Hyper-V not only means virtual machines, but it also means containers with Hyper-V isolation. So, couple things I want to point out. When it comes to nested Hyper-V, there are a few considerations. First, when Hyper-V is running inside of a virtual machine, hot add memory and dynamic memory do not work. You need to shut down the nested VM to change its memory size. This is by design. This is not a bug. That's how it works. We're not doing multiple levels of paging and stuff like that. So that's by design. Next, in order for network packets to be routed through two virtual switches, MAC address spoofing must be enabled on the first level, level 1 of the virtual switch. This is completed with the following PowerShell command, or you can enable it right here with Windows Admin Center. And of course, if you want to enable a nested Hyper-V, that can be done via PowerShell, or you can just do that with one click in Windows Admin Center. So we got you covered there. So we've talked about compute, we've talked about memory, we've talked about encryption, we've talked about storage, we've talked about some networking. Let's talk about some more networking in Windows Server 2022. So we're including some very nice networking performance improvements under the hood that have been brought over from Azure, starting with UDP. Now, UDP is becoming a very popular protocol carrying more and more network traffic. Example, UDP is being used for streaming, gaming protocols, and now there's the new QUIC protocol built on top of UDP, which brings the performance of UDP to a level on par with TCP. So you're going to see it used even more. Now, with the rise of UDP, we've added UDP segmentation offload, or USO, to Windows Server 2022. USO moves most of the work required to send UDP packets from the CPU to the network adapter's hardware. Now, complementing USO is UDP receive side coalescing, or UDP RSC. And this coalesces packets and reduces CPU usage for UDP processing. In addition to these new features, we also have made hundreds of improvements and optimizations to the UDP data path for both transmit and receive in both Windows Server 2022 and Windows 11. On the TCP side, we've also been collaborating in the industry to optimize performance for high-speed networks. Specifically, Windows Server 2022 uses TCP high start to reduce packet loss during connection startup, and this is especially important in high-speed networks. It also uses RAC, or Recent Acknowledgement Tail Loss Probe, to reduce retransmit timeouts. These features are enabled in the transport stack by default. They provide a smoother network data flow with better performance at high speeds, and both Windows Server 2022 and Windows 11 both have this new capability enabled by default. And then finally, in the Hyper-V virtual switch, these virtual switches have been enhanced with updated receive segment coalescing. This allows the hypervisor network to coalesce packets and process as one larger segment, and CPU cycles are reduced and segments will remain coalesced across the entire data path until processed by the intended application. This means improved performance for both network traffic from an external host received by a virtual NIC, as well as from a virtual NIC between virtual NICs on the same host. So some really nice networking performance really across the board for both UDP, for a lot of new workloads, TCP for your existing stuff, and for Hyper-V virtual switch receive side coalescing. I also want to point out, as much as I really don't want you logging into a Windows server directly, I want you, managing these remotely with Windows Admin Center or with Azure Arc or some other way. I do know that there are cases where you simply need to get on the server because there's, you have a legacy workload that has, requirements that you're on the box. And if you need a browser, again, I would much prefer you're browsing on your client machine. Don't browse on your server, but if you need it, we now include the latest version of Edge with Windows Server 2022. There's also another subtle improvement in Windows Server 2022, and I didn't think anybody would notice. I thought only, the uber geeks like me would notice. Turns out I'm pleasantly surprised by the number of people who've noticed that sconfig, which is a utility that's been built in Windows Server now for over 10 years, has been completely rewritten in PowerShell. And a number of items here have been subtly updated. And the goal of sconfig is clear, as it has been since day one. The goal of this is to quickly enable a server to get onto the network where it can then be managed remotely with PowerShell, Admin Center, or your management tool of choice. So that's another improvement also in 2022. All right, let's talk about application innovation. And quite honestly, we have been really busy here for many years now. We launched containers for Windows back in Windows Server 2016, and we have come a long way since then. You needed rapid container support. You basically, you needed us to support all sorts of innovation happening throughout the container lifecycle, whether it was working on optimizing images, whether it was working in the open source world, partnering with projects like Docker, Calico, Flannel, Kubernetes, and more. We've been doing this for years now, and we actually delivered this innovation very quickly. We delivered a rapid set of container releases, and these all had 18 months of support. And the reason why we did it is because, you know what, 1709 would come out, it had a whole bunch of new features, 1803 came out, and it had a whole bunch of new features, and people said, hey, no problem, you know what, I can just roll my container to the new container image and move right along, and that's great. Well, that was, starting back in 2016. Since then, a lot has changed. In fact, a lot of you have said, you know what, this has been great, but now our viewpoint has changed. Microsoft, the container features and open source integration is great. Our organization has what we need to run containers with Kubernetes. At this point, the biggest thing we need is not a feature. We need a longer support lifecycle. 18 months just isn't enough. Done. That's why we're introducing 5 years of container support. So for our customers that have made that move into containers, guess what? Now you can stay solid on. If that container release is working for you, guess what? You're going to be fine for 5 years. But in addition to the 5-year container support, we of course did a lot more too. Whole bunch of new features in 2022 containers, like the ability to use group managed service accounts without domain join hosts, run globally scalable applications with virtualized time zones, alignment with industry standard Containerd, bringing the latest and greatest to Windows and containers, enabling consistent network policy implementation across hybrid Kubernetes clusters, IPv6 support for Windows containers, multi-subnet support for Kubernetes worker nodes, and so much more in addition, like, for example, the container image optimization. So the most popular container image is Windows Server Core. And the reason why is because this one provides the backwards compatibility that if you're lifting and shifting an old application into a container, this is the image you're going to use. Well, guess what? We've kept all the compatibility you needed, but we've reduced it by a full gigabyte in size. That's the work that we've been doing together with our customers. And guess what? We've trimmed it even further. So in addition to Server Core Container, we also have Nano Server. Now, Nano Server is a 64-bit only runtime, which was designed for containers. This is not designed for backwards compatibility. If you need to run that old application you wrote for 2003 or 2008, it's an old .NET or Java application, whatever, and you want to containerize it, great, use the Server Core image. If you're building new container apps, that's what this one is designed for. Nano Server is 64-bit only. It's designed for containers. It's less than 100 megabytes, and it's optimized and hardened for building new cloud apps. And you can see here, it's quietly very popular. This is from the Docker Hub webpage, and you can see there's over 100 million downloads of Nano Server. So it's quietly very popular. So we have Nano Server, which is our ultralight modern Windows offering for new app development, and Server Core, which is best for lift and shift of your traditional Windows Server apps. We thought we had it all, but we heard from you that we still have a gap, and that gap is GPUs. Many of you want to build apps that use GPUs for machine learning. Done. That's why we're introducing the Windows Server base image. This image has nearly the full Windows API support and is built from Windows Server, not client. So it has server capabilities like supporting greater than 10 IIS connections. And this is introducing support for ML and GPU-dependent applications via DirectX for Windows containers. By enabling GPU acceleration for DirectX, this means we're also enabling GPU acceleration for any frameworks built on top of DirectX. And one example of that is Windows ML, a set of APIs providing fast and efficient AI inferencing capabilities. With GPU acceleration in Windows containers, now your devs can have access to first-class inferencing runtime that can be accelerated across a broad set of capable GPU acceleration hardware. Now, to make this even easier for lift and shift, many organizations have developers that are building containers for new apps, but you've also told us you'd like some help modernizing those existing ones. Well, Windows Admin Center has the container tool with an easy to use and friendly UI, just keeps getting better and better. In fact, the latest version will even create Docker files for you. So if you've never done it, it'll handle it for you. Admin Center supports containerizing ASP.NET and web deploy, and lets you easily deploy containerized applications to AKS or AKS on Azure Stack HCI directly. However, we want to do more. We also know that many of you are using the Azure migration tools and are comfortable with these. So we've added a new Azure Migrate containerization app to containerize your existing Windows Server apps as part of Azure Migrate. So with the Containerize app, it targets the running server, extracts the content to be containerized, uses the Azure Container Registry, and creates a new container to deploy on AKS. The containerized app supports ASP.NET IIS, and by the way, neither of these tools require any code changes to your existing apps. That's critical. That's critical. That means your existing stuff runs unchanged. All right. Been talking about cloud, been talking about cloud native apps, been talking about containerization. It's time to discuss cloud innovation with Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition. So Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition, that may sound like a mouthful, and it kind of is. The reason why it's named this way is because it includes all the Data Center Edition features and then adds additional Azure and Windows Server innovation on top of that. So this version includes the latest hybrid and compute features. It has unique capabilities that only this edition has. This runs in the Azure cloud. And if you go, hey, wait a minute, I want some of these features on premises, you can run it also on premises on Azure Stack HCI, our on-premises Azure footprint. It's also the best Windows Server VM for use with Azure Auto Manage, and I'll explain that in just a second. So what's new? What's different? What makes this so special? Well, this innovation starts with hot patching. You can now hot patch, you can update in-memory code of running processes. There's no process restart, there's no reboot required. I do want to point out that this currently requires server core. I underline the word currently, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about hot patching in just a second. Next, we also have SMB over quick. So remember all that TLS 1.3 I was talking about earlier? Well, this is one of the reasons why this is so important. SMB over quick introduces an alternative to the TCP network transport, providing secure, reliable connectivity to edge file servers over untrusted networks like the wide open internet. SMB over quick offers an SMB VPN for telecommuters, mobile device users, and high security organizations. The server certificate creates a TLS 1.3 encrypted tunnel over UDP port 443 instead of TCP port 445. Now, SMB behaves normally within the quick tunnel, meaning the user experience, it looks exactly the same. Nothing changes, which is exactly what you want. And SMB features like multi-channel, signing, compression, continuous availability, direct releasing, and so on. All these features, they just work normally. SMB over quick is great for edge devices so they can safely access a file server. It's also great for telecommuters, mobile device, and hybrid workers with Windows 11. Finally, we have Azure Extended Networking, which is designed to solve the challenge of moving apps to the cloud and need to maintain the same IP addresses. Think about that. How many times have you thought, gosh, I'd love to move this, but this thing is so old. We know that there are hard-coded IP addresses, and we're not even sure all of the dependencies. So if we try and move this to the cloud, it's going to break. Azure Extended Networking enables you to stretch an on-premises subnet into Azure to let your on-prem virtual machines keep their original on-premises private IP addresses when migrating to Azure. The network is extended using a bidirectional VXLAN tunnel between two Windows Server 2022 VMs acting as virtual appliances. One is running on premises, and the other is running Windows Server 2022 Datacenter Azure Edition in Azure, with each also connected to the subnet to be extended. Each subnet that you're going to extend requires a pair of appliances. And in fact, a common question I'm asked, can I do multiple subnets? Yes, absolutely, you can do multiple subnets. These can be extended using multiple pairs. At the end of the day, the way you want to think about it is quite simply, Azure Extended Networking provides a path to IP independence. This has been like the holy grail for a whole bunch of customers out there looking for exactly that, and that's what we're delivering. All right. So hot patching, SMB over quick, extended networking. Let's get back to hot patching, because every time I talk about hot patching, everyone goes, whoa, this is crazy. I want to see this. All right, let me actually show this to you. So hot patching is a new way to install updates that doesn't require a reboot and won't interrupt workloads running on your server. So before we start, let me kind of describe this environment. On the right, I have a new Windows Server 2022 core VM created with Auto Manage, and I'm going to manually install hot patch updates. Now for comparison, on the left-hand side, I have a Windows Server 2022 core VM, and I'm going to install a comparable latest cumulative update, what we call an LCU. This is a traditional update. On each VM, I've queued up two massive file copies, so you can see them as sample workloads. And on top, you can see there's a timer here, so we can track the status of the patching installation. So to be nice, I'm going to actually start off the patch installation on each VM, and I'm going to do the traditional LCU. I'm going to do that one first, the latest cumulative update. And so you can see that one's going. Now let's do the hot patch update, and whoops, it's done. So if you blinked, you may have missed it. And as you can see, by the way, the file copy continues uninterrupted. And you can see on the left-hand side, the traditional LCU is still cranking away over there. So I feel kind of bad. In case you missed the first hot patch, let's actually run a second hot patch. We're going to install a second one. And hold on one sec here. Let's do the second hot patch. And you can see that is now, yep, that one's done too, with zero impact to the running workload. Now, one of the great advantages of hot patches is that the changes are made in memory. This means that even running processes will pick up the new updates immediately and without interruption. Now, we've installed these updates manually for the demo, but you can see how impactful this would be if I was using update orchestration and management tools developed for hot patching like Azure Auto Manage. So the left one's still going, so let's speed up the video here so we can get to the completion of the traditional update, because I want you to be able to see that. And you can see when it gets to the end, it now requires a reboot to complete the update process. So if I reboot right now, it's going to interrupt my file copy. So I'm going to wait for the file copy to complete. Let me zip ahead on that one as well. And let's speed ahead to the end of that. And once that's done, we can perform the reboot. And now the copy is done, whereas the hot patch has been done for quite a while. So that was a quick demo of hot patching with Windows Server 2022 Datacenter Azure Edition. Now, every time I do this demo, someone says, oh my gosh, I want this on premises too. How can I get this on premises? So let me explain to you how I can get this on premises. So Windows Server 2022 Datacenter Azure Edition, like I said, this is an Azure feature. So you can get this in the Azure cloud, or you can get this if you're running Azure Stack HCI on premises. And we actually have a fantastic story, a Windows Server better together with Azure Stack HCI. There's a bunch of benefits you get. Number one, you get access to Datacenter Azure Edition. So the hot patching, the extended network, the SMB over quick, all those features, because I've seen people say, boy, not only do I want hot patching, but I definitely want an extended network, and I definitely want the SMB over quick because I've got mobile users out there and I would love to have that on premises. Great, you can get that with Azure Stack HCI. In addition, if you're using Azure Stack HCI, and this is huge, folks, you get free extended security updates. I cannot stress this enough. This is critical because I know customers that are paying large sums of money to Microsoft for ESUs. So let's suppose, for example, you were spending $500,000 on ESUs. You could either A, pay us for ESUs, or B, you could buy $500,000 worth of Azure Stack HCI, which is a lot of brand new, super hot, super secure, super ridiculously fast hardware, and get those same ESUs and put these VMs on it and get all the ESUs at no additional cost. It's kind of a no-brainer. So there's a whole bunch of work we're doing to make these better together. In addition to Azure Stack HCI, of course, running Windows Server and your ESUs, let me also point out, let's not forget that you get more. Not only do you get Windows Server, but also AKS. So I talked about containers. Well, guess what? Azure Stack HCI also provides the Azure Kubernetes service. So as you deploy apps into AKS in Azure, if you decide, hey, you know what? I need to deploy some of these on premises. Well, guess what? Azure Stack HCI includes the same AKS on premises so that you can tell your developers, we'll just point to this AKS on premises and now you can deploy those apps. And here's the beauty of it all. As I mentioned earlier, if you try to manage and deploy AKS on premises, it can be challenging. If you try to manage and deploy Kubernetes on premises, it can be challenging. For us, with AKS on HCI, we manage it all for you. New version of Kubernetes comes out, great, we patch it for you. You want it secured? Guess what? We ship it secure by default. So all of a sudden now, you can focus your developers on deploying cloud apps wherever they need to. And for the folks running infrastructure, we've made this really easy. And there's more, by the way, PaaS services. So you can manage SQL app services, functions, logic apps, and more. And then finally, I also want to point out that Azure Stack HCI integrates with Azure itself. So for example, when you deploy an Azure Stack HCI cluster, guess what? It just appears in the Azure portal. And so now you can deploy your Azure Stack HCIs to multiple locations, to multiple countries, to multiple regions, to multiple cities, and they all appear right here in the Azure portal. You can use tags, you can use role-based access, you can provide governance, you can provide consistent policy to all of your Azure Stack HCIs. Oh, and by the way, if you deploy the Azure Arc to your Windows servers running as virtual machines on top of Azure Stack HCI, you can also provide that same governance and policy, and it will also appear right here in the Azure portal. So you can see just how awesome this is from an end-to-end solution. So I told you I had a lot of content and I was going quickly because I know there'll be questions. But Windows Server 2022 was driven by your requirements. It's got advanced multi-layer security. Again, we are hardening the OS. We are protecting it against the latest malware and ransomware. We've got hybrid capabilities to extend your data center to Azure for greater IT efficiency. For the application platform, oh my gosh, we're doing so much for containers, for container management, for Kubernetes, for integration with the open source community, with optimizing of container images. We want to make sure we've got the best solution for you today and going forward. And then finally, we want to help you evolve your organization with those new apps and that Azure innovation that I showed off with Azure Windows Server Data Center Azure Edition, which includes all sorts of cool benefits like SMB over quick, hot patching, extended networks. And of course, all of this plugs right into Azure Stack HCI. We've got a great story for you going forward. So with that, I want to say thank you so very much. I appreciate your time. And with that, Steve, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Yeah, there is a bunch of questions in the chat. Let's see. They're just coming in. Did he just drop 0.5 million for HCI? I don't know if you know it.
No, the comment I was, no, I didn't.
Okay.
No, HCI does not cost $500,000. You can get HCI for under $20,000. You can get this on as small as 2 nodes. That's one of the beauties of Azure Stack HCI is we can scale all the way down to the super tiny edge. That's something that Azure Stack HCI that nobody else can do. The others are following us. Azure Stack HCI was the first HCI solution in market and has been for some time now that can go all the way down to 2 nodes. You still get high availability, you still get resiliency, you still get Azure integration. And of course, if you want to scale all the way to the other end of the spectrum, yeah, we can give you big monster data center solutions. The $500,000 was an example I was thinking of as a recent customer I spoke to that's about spending that much money on ESUs. And I said, I understand that you're spending this on ESUs. Would you like some hardware instead that gives you those same ESUs? And when I explained to them that ESUs come for Azure Stack HCI for free, they were like out of their mind. They were like, whoa, we're going to go buy some hardware right now. So that was the point I was making. But no, Azure Stack HCI scales all the way down to 2 nodes.
Mark writes, does Nano or base container have PowerShell 5.1 or 7 included?
It does not. That would be something you would need to add to the container image afterwards.
Mark also asks, you can't run HCI on VMware, correct?
Cannot, no.
Cannot, all right.
Nope.
Let's see. General departmental home shares, we've been enabling encryption, but have been doing one-off single user hidden shares for SMB v2 multifunction access only without standing up additional servers. Oh, I guess somebody was replying to another comment there. Sorry about that. And if anybody wants to come off mute and ask a question, please do so. Can client access files in Azure File Sync when this standalone server is down for maintenance?
Yes. The whole beauty of the Windows file server, Azure Files, and Azure File Sync is it's just super compelling. I mean, what you're essentially doing is, you know, there's a number of scenarios where imagine, in fact, let me see if I've got, I may actually have, yeah, let me show you something here. So with Windows Server 2022 File Server and Azure File Sync, there's a ton of benefits. Number one, you get multi-site sync. So imagine you've got a file server in your headquarters and you've got a file server in a branch location. So you can set up multi-site sync so these would actually be syncing to multiple sites simultaneously. That's one benefit. And that could be for all sorts of things. That could be apps, that could be user for data. The second one is cloud tiering. To me, this is the mother load. This is the big one. I mean, think about this for a second. Like I said, you've got a branch file server, and in the history of man, no one has ever purchased a file server and said, oh, this is fantastic. I will never need to buy storage again. Never happened. No one has ever said that because you always run out of storage. It is constant like the sun coming up in the morning. And so what happens is with cloud tiering is, you know, your hot data, you want it sitting there locally in the branch. You want the people that are in that building that are accessing it to hit that file server because it's right there and fast. However, those files that have been sitting around on the file server that nobody's touched in 10 years, I'll give you a perfect example. A lot of file servers have a folder that for everybody, for their own user data. And it gets really, really big and really, really full. And the IT pros, IT admins send out email, hey, please clean out your user file. We're running low on storage. Nobody ever does. And it turns out everybody has, 50 copies of the same PowerPoint deck in their user folder. Well, guess what? You can now seamlessly, transparently tier that up to the cloud. You just set a policy. All you do is set the number. How much free space do I want to keep on this share? I think by default it's 20%. It will automatically do that. So cloud tiering. Next, also backup. So now that you've got things that are actually, tiering into the cloud, guess what? You can back it up into the cloud. And of course, this also gives you a DR story. So what happens if that file server dies? Guess what? Oh no, where are those files? How do I get to it? Well, folks can access the Azure file share, still get access to those files. And if they order that gives them time to order a replacement. When the replacement comes, it'll automatically sync, and boom, you're back in business. So this is a tremendous solution, and I have run into just lots of happy customers that are using Azure File Sync. Like I said, it basically transforms your local file server into a hot cache, and then basically the cloud becomes endless, bottomless storage for you.
So a couple more questions. When tiering content up to the cloud, can you benefit from any compression or dedupe?
It will undedupe it on the way to the cloud. There is some work that we are looking at to potentially improve the dedupe story, but it will undedupe it when it moves it to the cloud.
Sure. And one last question, I'm pretty sure the answer to this is going to be no, but are there any plans for Windows 10 to support SMB compression? I can get my servers to 2022 without too much pain, but all my clients seems like it's going to take a long time before I can really take advantage of that feature.
Yeah, it's a Windows 11 feature.
Yep. All right, on that note, I think we will call this a wrap. Again, Jeff, thank you very much. I put a link to the survey in there if everybody can fill out the survey. And at this point, I'm going to stop recording.